Today I'll be continuing my examination of religion, its origins, its evolution, its destination, and contrasting that with spirituality. So I picked out two short readings, one from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 6, which for me speaks about mystical spirituality, and a passage from Matthew's Gospel in chapter 23, where you look at what a legalistic religion turns into. From Isaiah chapter 6. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and exalted, seated on a throne. And the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling one to another, Kadosh, 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 holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? And who will go for us? And I said, here I am, send me. And contrast that with Matthew talking about legalistic religion. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works that they do. For they preach, but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders. But they themselves are not willing to move them even with a single finger. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You neither enter yourselves, nor allow those who would enter to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you travel across sea and land to make a single convert. And when he becomes a convert, you make him twice as much a child of hell as you yourselves. Words inspired by God. The very first World Parliament of Religions was held in Chicago in 1893. And it was the first time ever that theologians and gurus of various systems got together in a serious exchange of ideas. So we had Hindus there for the first time, Buddhists, people from the Jain religion, many different Eastern traditions and the Western traditions, obviously. And at that conference, it was a really great conference, and it was held many times since then. I remember attending a version of it in Salt Lake City, Utah, a few years ago. Michael Choi was there, a few more of us from CIJ. But at that very first one, there was a very famous debate between 2 European theologians as to whether or not it was preferable, if you were a religious person, whether you should just cleave to one particular religion and try to tunnel down really deeply into it, or whether you should try to cross-fertilize by studying many different religious traditions. And there was one famous English theologian who quoted an English proverb that said, he knows not England who only England knows. In other words, if you're born and raised in England and you've never been outside it, you don't really know England until you've gone to other places and have something with which to compare England. So his belief system was that you had to cast your net very widely. My own particular belief system is that it is both and. It is the ability to cross-fertilize many different wisdom traditions, and at the same time to have a home base that you dig down so deeply that you go right down into the water table, the mystical impulse that gave birth to all religions. So that's what I want to go today in today's homily. Last Sunday, I talked about the fact that there are 4,300 different religions on our planet at the moment, but that they're divided into 2 groups by religious sociologists. They call them the ascending religions and the descending religions. But I suggested that there are some religions that don't fit neatly into that, particularly shamanism, and in very particular, Celtic cosmology, that is about ascending and descending. So today I want to examine that concept further. So I'm going to talk about interweaving, ascending and descending religious traditions. Then I want to talk about the movement from religion to spirituality. I want to have a quick look at what do we mean by God. Fourthly, I want to examine this thing I've been saying to you for months and months and months, incarnation as ordination. I want to look at the idea of mission. And then I want to give another exegesis of the story of Jacob's ladder. So that's where I'll go today, with God's help. So firstly, I want to look at the interweaving of ascending and descending religions. I don't think that they have to be separated from each other, that either you join an ascending religion with the focus on heaven or a descending religion with the focus on planet Earth. And so I want to come up with just two images to illustrate what I have in mind today. And the first one is the Star of David. If you look at the Star of David, it actually consists of two triangles superimposed on each other. You have an ascending triangle and you have a descending triangle. And when they're overlaid, you've got this six-pointed star called the Star of David. And that for me represents the meeting of the ascending and the descending religions, a place where they're both true. And so, for instance, if I were to use an example, it's like the difference between pantheism and panentheism. Pantheism is the belief system that God is simply the total collection of all that exists. So that's a very, very kind of an earth-based descending model. You know, that you look around you and everything you see, put them all together, and that's God. That's called pantheism. But there's another notion called panentheism. And panentheism is that God is both the total of everything that you can see and experience, and a lot more that you can't see or experience. And the example I use sometimes is like, pantheism is like the collected works of Shakespeare, whereas panentheism is Shakespeare himself. There's a lot more to Shakespeare than his collected works. He had thoughts that were never written down or expressed, and certainly didn't find their way into book form. So the difference between the man Shakespeare and his collected works is the difference between panentheism and pantheism. So God is everything that exists and can be experienced, and a lot more besides. So the Star of David represents that for me, that it's a combination of the two, both ascending and descending, and they're not separate. Yeah, they lie with each other. The second image I want to use is that of a tree. And particularly when I look at deciduous trees, the great big oak trees of Europe, and even where I live right now. And what I see is that, yeah, they're almost mirror images of each other, that what's underground that can't be seen and what's overground are absolutely like, they're mirror images around the axle of the earth, the dirt itself. And so as it branches out into the sky and sends limbs and branches and twigs and leaves spreading out upwards and outwards, the same thing is happening to its root system. So that for me represents the interweaving between the ascending and the descending religions. That a better system is that it is the tree of life. It's chaim. It is the tree that spreads equally above into the heavens and below into the earth. So for me, that's a beautiful image of what real religion is like, that it is earth-based and heaven-centered at the same time. So that's the first point that I want to make. I want to look then at the kind of the evolution from religion to spirituality. And I've said to you many times that if I were to define religion in just a single statement, I would say that religion is the training wheels for spirituality. And I use this image. Imagine a little baby, a toddler, who's just learning to scramble around on the ground, occasionally able to lift himself up, but he's scrambling around. And his focal point is mama. And mama's inside in the kitchen, you know, washing dishes. And the little toddler is scrambling around, and it goes out to the hallway, and he looks back. And as long as he can see mother, he'll keep exploring. If at some stage he can't see mother, he's going to freak out and run back screaming to where she is. But even if mother is walking around the house, as long as the child is exploring and can still see the mother, it will keep exploring. But if on a regular basis he can't see mother, he'll stop exploring. Now, in some senses, this is what religion and spirituality are meant to be. At some stage, the child needs to explore the terrain to find out other religions and other wisdom traditions and have a home base that it can come back to. But in some senses, that's a temporary stage of the evolution of the little child. By the time that child gets to be a teenager, the teenager is not that interested anymore in keeping mother in sight. The teenager wants to go and explore for herself. And at some stage, when the teenager becomes an adult, it's going to move away from home completely and start, her own family or whatever. So in some senses, that's the need for us to outgrow religion. It's training wheels. It's the apron strings of mother. And it is vitally important at some stage. But we need to move into spirituality. And as I said last Sunday, spirituality does not mean that we don't need community or that we don't need ritual. I'm not saying that at all, but that in some senses, it's not tied to a kind of a legalistic religion. And so when you look then at how religion has evolved, you see that with Homo sapiens sapiens going back about 70,000 years, originally there's this total ignorance about who we are, where we came from, what happens when we die. And so we start off with the ignorance of just assembling the data of our experiences of life. At some stage, this morphs into a polytheistic notion that there are many, many divinities out there responsible for everything we see. The sun and the moon and the stars are different kinds of gods, and we live at their behest. And at some stage, this begins to kind of coalesce into kind of a monotheism, so that the polytheistic system shrinks down to the belief system that there is only actually one God. But monotheism is not the end of the journey, because monotheism, if it doesn't evolve, very, very quickly stagnates. And so you very quickly get fundamentalistic, versions of monotheism. You get monotheism, which is founded on dogma, on empty ritual that really signifies nothing while attempting to symbolize the divine, but actually signify nothing. Or it gets bogged down in kind of literal interpretations of the great stories, the great myths, or even the great scriptural traditions. We begin to interpret them literally. And at that stage, monotheism has ground to a stagnated halt. So religion, monotheistic religion, needs to evolve into mystical spirituality. And mystical spirituality itself is a moving target. It too is evolving. So mystical spirituality must go beyond any kind of denominational affiliation into what I would call a kind of a trans-dimensional traveling. The mystic within each one of us is called to surf different kinds of energies, to be able to experience different kinds of dimensions, different states of consciousness. It means having the ability to encounter different entities, whether we're talking about, angelic beings, astral beings, sprites, forest spirits, or whatever they are, everywhere that the Spirit of God exists in whatever form, to be able to encounter these. It means having the ability to be able to transcend time and space and causation. And we do that every night in our dreams. In your dreams, you've transcended time. You've transcended space. You could be 10,000 miles away and 5,000 years in the past instantaneously. And the only causation is the causation created by your thought processes. To think is to actually manifest immediately. So that for me is where spirituality is headed, and the difference between spirituality and mere religion. That's my second point. When we then start wrestling with the notion of God in this developing model, we have to first establish who God is not, because who God is has been created by dogmatic monotheistic religion very often, and that's totally inadequate. So who is God and who is God not? So firstly, very importantly, God is not a person. So when we talk about the three persons of the Holy Trinity, we totally misunderstand what the word person, persona in Latin, and prosopon in the original Greek, what they mean. So God is not a person, but you can only have a personal relationship with God. I live in the middle of the forest. The forest is not a person, but I'm a person. So the only kind of relationship I can have with the forest is a personal relationship. So God is not a person or even a trinity of persons. But since I'm a person and you're a person, the only kind of relationship you can have with the transcendent is a personal relationship, as long as you don't think that God is actually somebody sitting on a throne with a long white beard. Secondly, I believe God is not a lawyer, but there are cosmic principles like karma or love. So God is not dictating, enacting decrees and punishing us for the infraction of these decrees. God is not a lawyer. He doesn't make laws, doesn't apply laws, and doesn't punish laws. But God indeed is the origin of the laws through which the cosmos itself exists, whether you're talking about gravity, electromagnetism, or karma. And so in that sense, all flows from God. God is not partisan. To think that there's a chosen race or that extra ecclesiam nulla est salus outside the Catholic Church, there's no salvation, is absolutely ludicrous. God is no more partisan than the sunlight out there is partisan. No matter how many people stand outside in that hillside today, none of them is denying sunlight to anybody else. God is not partisan. And God is not a micromanager. God is not, concerned with the details of our lives, deciding that he's going to let one person die of cancer and he's going to cure the other person. Or that one person is going to win, one team is going to win the football match and the other are going to wind up losing. So these are the ideas of God that we have to shed. A personal God, a legal God, a partisan God, and a micromanaging God. And we have to walk ourselves through the realization that we've employed very many different kinds of languages as we speak about God. So there's cataphatic language. These are Greek terms. Cataphatic language is the language employed by theologians to try to wrestle with God and try to tell you who God is and what God had for breakfast. Then there is apophatic language, the language of the mystics. Neti, neti, not this, not that. The notion of the Zen koan. What did your original face look like before your great-grandparents were born? Or what is the sound of one hand clapping? These cannot be understood rationally. And so apophatic language is God is not that. X, God is not X. Y, God is not Y. Z, no, God is not Z. So you back yourself into the experience of the divine rather than try to articulate yourself into an understanding of the divine. A third kind of language is what I would call parabolic language. The language that teachers and storytellers have to employ in order to speak about that which is utterly transcendent. And Jesus was a master at this kind of language, using all kinds of stories and allegories in order to speak about that which is totally ineffable. And then there's the analytic language of kind of historians as they trace the evolution of the human species. So there's very different kinds of God talk. You have to figure out, which of these God talks is most likely to give you an experience of the divine. Then I believe that religion has gone through 5 very different stages. Our spirituality has gone through 5 very different stages. And the first one I would say is that we began speaking about the gods. And this was the task of the theologians, to try to kind of figure out who's actually pulling the strings up there in the heavens. So the first kind of era of religion was speaking about the gods. The second era of religion was speaking to the gods. And this was the domain of the priests, who through prayer or ritual were attempting to make contact and intercede with these gods for blessings of various kinds. That would have been stage 2. Stage 3 would be speaking on behalf of God. And this was the idea of the prophet, that the prophet spoke on behalf of God to an entire nation. So this notion that God speaks through selected individuals. And then the fourth stage is speaking not about God, not to God, or not on behalf of God, but as God. And that's what the mystic does. Because the mystic has long since lost his own sense of ego and is now speaking from the source itself. So the mystic is speaking as God. But there's a fifth stage even beyond that. And that is the era of total silence. It's the hermit, the place where you realize that even to speak as God, language itself is such a leaky vessel that there are no words adequate to try to contain the experience of source. And so for me, that's where these are the ways we step ourselves through mystical spirituality. It's my third point. So since we've been doing the Zoom masses, I've begun every Sunday by saying that every single one of us is a priest, that incarnation equals ordination. So I want to expand on that a little bit this morning. This was the reason that I chose this beautiful passage from Isaiah chapter 6, where God says, whom will we send? Who will speak on our behalf? And Isaiah puts his hand up and says, send me, Lord, I'll go. And so in some senses, that's already ordination. Everybody who put their hand up, and every one of us did, and said to God, send me, I'll go. There's not a human being on planet Earth who didn't volunteer to do that. but 99.99% of us are asleep at the wheel. We've forgotten that we volunteered to be here now. We've forgotten the fact that every single one of us is a priest who volunteered through incarnation to be available to the planet for the evolution of the planet. And so the priest in you and the priest in me must become familiar with the thin places. You must be able to move almost at will into the experience, to move through the veil, to become a veil piercer. If you're to be a priest for other people, you need to be able to pull back the veils so that others can see through to the other side, so that they too eventually become veil piercers themselves. Your job, once you realize that you're a priest, is to help an entire community, perhaps, to glimpse the mystical reality behind the illusion of the merely physical. And anybody who's willing to do that and is able to do that is a priest. The rest of us are priests who are asleep. There's a Latin phrase for that, in pectore, that somehow deep within it's a reality, but I haven't articulated or even become aware of it yet. So then, as you exercise your priesthood, there are specific kinds of ministry that you're going to be called to. So how do you determine what your particular ministry is like? And for me, again, there are 4 stages to that process. Firstly, you have to identify a need in your community. Secondly, you volunteer to address that need. Thirdly, you're given the training to be able to do that sufficiently. And then fourthly, you're going to be commissioned by your community to act in that capacity on its behalf. And that is ministry, and that is priesthood. And no hierarchy can do that for you. Only your own soul and your own community. So then each one of us has to look within our hearts, understand that we're priests for a community and for the community of the planet itself, and ask the questions, what are the needs in my community? And the community can be like anything from COJ to Homo sapiens sapiens. What are the needs in my community? Can I volunteer to address a particular need? Do I have the ability, or do I need training to do it? And finally, will my community commission me to act in that capacity on their stead? And so that's, in some senses, how we move into our priesthood, which is our birthright. Maybe then our job is to be people who try to create community. And then we have to be really, really careful that we don't get stuck in a rut. Rather, we live in a spiral, visiting the same issues, but at a higher and a higher level. Because inevitably, when you study human history, very, very often religions and even great social movements get stuck in a rut. Typically, it goes from an avatar, an original visionary who has a mystical impulse. This person is so charismatic that they draw disciples around them. Eventually, this person is going to die or very often be killed. If it's a prophet, he's going to be killed, very likely. Now there's a community left behind, and this community organizes itself in some kind of an organization. This gives birth to a religion. Very, very soon, the religion is taken over by some kind of an oligarchy. They create a theology and they create orthodoxy. And if they're in a position to impose it on others, there is inquisitions and crusades. And finally, the thing has imploded. The community has imploded, and along comes a brand new prophet to try to raise it from the ashes. And we've seen this in all great world religions. My favorite example, perhaps, is the Christian church. With from the extraordinary impulse of this God-man, carpenter Jesus, who founded this new version of Judaism. He wasn't intending to start a brand new religion, but to kind of rediscover the mystical core of his own ancient tradition. And this spins off as the Christian movement, which is really, really beautiful, and then quickly disintegrates into the Roman Empire until finally finally it has imploded and is unrecognizable from what Jesus said. And then comes along another great prophet, Francis of Assisi, around the year 1200. And Francis begins a whole new movement of renewal within the Christian churches. And within 300 years, it is Francis' own community, the Franciscans, who are responsible for the Inquisition in Europe. So you get the same cycle happening again and again. So we have to be really, really careful that when we form communities, that we avoid that temptation. Now, for me, there are 3 vital facets. And this was kind of my modus operandi when I was starting, churches or Christian communities in Kenya for 14 years. And I operated according to three Swahili principles that I had. The first one is kujitegemea, which means self-reliance. The second one was kujitumikia, which means self-ministering. And the third one was kujieneza, which was self-expansion. And that, for me, that's the beauty of a community, that a community has to be self-reliant. It can't depend on outsiders to finance it, and it can't depend on outsiders to minister to it. That whatever needs are in the community, whether it's lectors, communion ministers, priests, whatever it is, have to be found within the community itself. And that if the community is doing something really, really good, it'll expand, not because it's advertising itself, but because the message and the behavior is really inspirational to other people who want to be part of the same thing. So that for me is what I would call then the kind of the formation of community. And each one of us then comes in with a specific mission. You come in here bearing two kinds of gifts. The first kind of gifts are your talents, but these talents do not belong to you any more than the envelopes in the mailman's bag belong to the mailman. His job is to deliver them. They belong to the people whose names are on the envelopes. So whatever talents you have do not belong to you. You are asked to come down to give them to the community. But mostly we hog these. We want to make a killing out of these things. We want to become multimillionaires because of the talents, whether we're basketball players or whatever we are. And the second kind of gifts we come down with are our problems, our individual problems, because these are our gift to ourselves. These are the guarantee that we're going to have to stretch and grow and evolve in this incarnation. But what do most of us do? We project our problems onto others, and we accuse them of having the things that we ourselves have inside us. So we hog that which was meant for others, and we project that which was meant for ourselves. So that's how we screw up mission in some way. We have to realize as well that our mission is never about personal salvation. We did not come say to God, send me, I will go. When God said, whom shall I send? Who will come and speak on our behalf? He was asking us to come down in order to be part of a cosmic evolutionary shift, not just even on planet Earth, but throughout the entire universe. So it's not just about personal salvation. It's not about getting to the end of your life, making a perfect act of contrition, getting the last anointing, saying, I made it, and abandoning the rest of us. So there are stages again to this cosmic journey, this journey that I've described as a single safari from God's womb to God's heart, just like a mother births a baby and takes it from her own womb to her own breast. That is the journey of cosmic evolution. And so that journey consists of the following kinds of stages. Firstly, there's separation from source. We're fractals, holographic fractals of the one. This leads to separation anxiety. As surely as the little infant who's wandered into the dining room and can no longer see the mother in the kitchen is freaking out. The third stage is xenophobia. Since we now regard ourselves as separate ontologically discrete entities, now we have problems with other people, especially if they look different from us, or they're part of a different religious belief system. Then there's inevitably a breakdown. And hopefully, if we have the courage, the breakdown will lead to a breakthrough. And the breakthrough will result in initially individual enlightenment, and then finally the awakening of the entire cosmos, until again all is one. And finally, I want to talk about a new kind of a new exegesis of the story of Jacob's ladder. Many, many years ago, I began to realize that the cross in Christian iconography is not about an instrument of death or an instrument of torture. That is not what Jesus was leaving us. This was not the kind of indelible, kind of final image that Jesus wanted to impress upon people, that of a man dying, terribly on a cross, nailed to a piece of wood. That's not what the image means to me. What it meant to me is that there's a vertical kind of arm of it, and there's a horizontal arm of it. The horizontal arm means my connection to all living beings, what the Native American Indian people will call all my relations. And when they say all my relationships, all my relations, they're not talking about aunts and uncles and grandparents. They're talking about all sentient beings. So the horizontal arm of the cross represents the fact that we are connected There's a brotherhood, sisterhood between all sentient beings. And the vertical arm of the cross represents the connection between the immanent and the transcendent, between the earthly and the heavenly. And the intersection point of those two is yourself, your sense of personal self. You are the intersection between these two arms, between the connection of all living beings and the connection of earth to heaven. So that was a vision I had many, many, many years ago. 2 or 3 weeks ago, when I read this passage about Jacob's ladder, I had a new hit on this. And if you remember, I read it last Sunday as the initial reading. Jacob is on his way to Mesopotamia to get a wife for himself. And he's asleep, and he has a rock under his head, and he has a vision of this stairway joining heaven and earth. And there are angels coming up and coming down. So this is not just an ascending religion. The angels are not just going up to heaven. They're coming down from heaven and going back up and down. So it's an ascending and a descending religion. There's traffic going in both directions. Now, in some senses, you could then say that that's the vertical arm of a new kind of a cross. The vertical arm is the fact that there's a connection between earth and heaven. And there are angelic beings constantly making that journey. And they do it every day, every moment of every day. There is constant traffic from source, attempting to wake us up and invite us into the realization of our own transcendence and our own unity consciousness. So Jacob's ladder for me represents that connection between earth and heaven. But there's another piece, there's a horizontal arm to that. When Jericho fell in the year 1210 BCE, according to the Hebrew scriptures, Joshua captured Jericho, and then spent the next 200 years trying to capture the entire land of Canaan, culminating in the capture of Jerusalem in the year 1010 BCE under King David. So a 200-year conquest of physical violence, so they visited their will on the people present there. Jesus tells a very, very different story. Jesus tells a story about a man not going from Jericho to Jerusalem in a bloody conquest, but a man going from Jerusalem to Jericho, who's set upon, by muggers who leave him half dead. And a priest passes by and ignores him, and a Levite passes by and ignores him, but the enemy figure, the Samaritan, passes, takes him, heals him, brings him all the way to Jericho, tends to him, and pays for his board and keep and his healing. So Jesus is reversing the journey of Joshua. Jesus is beginning in Jerusalem and ending in Jericho. And it's a conquest of love. And that, in some senses, now you have the horizontal arm of the cross, where Jacob's ladder is the vertical arm of the cross. And it's fascinating to me that all of these are J sounds, more realistically Y sounds. There is no J in the Hebrew language. It's a Y. And so many of the great initial Bible scholars were Germans. And so J and Y are interchangeable in German. And so the word, for instance, Jacob with a J is actually Yaakov in Hebrew with a Y. The word Jericho with a J is Jericho, with a Y in it. Jerusalem is actually Yerushalayim, with a Y in it. Joshua is Yeshua, and Jesus is Yehoshua. So they're all Y sounds. So all of these parts of the ladder are this extraordinary kind of spiral of these beautiful Y sounds. And together they give us the full picture of what Jesus really represented. This cross, which is not about crucifixion, this cross, which is not about torture, this cross, which is not about death, this cross, which is the beautiful combination of ascending and descending religions, so that the angelic beings are constantly gaining access to the world of form. And we human beings, once we transcend our identification with our physical spacesuits, are on the return journey. And we make this journey on a regular basis, bringing down the realization of the divine into the world of the ordinary. Namaste, my brothers and sisters.